Hey guys, tonight we begin with a role no one volunteered for, being a child in the Middle Ages. And I know that doesn't sound like a job, but trust me, it came with more responsibilities, danger, and unpaid overtime than you'd believe. In a world where being a rat catcher was considered normal and plague survival was a full-time lifestyle, just making it to your 5th birthday was a major accomplishment. Medieval childhood wasn't about wooden toys and singing by the fire. It was more like, wake up, carry buckets, dodge dysentery, and don't cry, or someone might think you're lazy. There were no bedtime stories, just real-time lessons in disease, famine, and the occasional arranged marriage. And if you're picturing peasant kids as the only ones struggling, spoiler alert, noble kids weren't much better off. They just had more silk, stricter rules, and fancier punishments. So, before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of grim, weird, slightly depressing history helps you wind down. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where this little medieval misery tour is reaching. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle in, because tonight we're going back to a time when being born was dangerous, but being a kid, that was worse. From the moment you could walk, you were expected to work, not help, not contribute, work, as in daily, physical, exhausting, repetitive, and entirely non-optional. If you were lucky, your first task was feeding chickens or watching the fire. If not, you were hauling buckets of water twice your weight or herding livestock that didn't care you were 3 feet tall. There was no age of play. Childhood wasn't a protected phase of life. It was a holding pattern between birth and usefulness. And if you couldn't prove your usefulness quickly, well, then you were just another mouth to feed in a world that rarely had enough bread for the people already working. No toys, no breaks, no expectations beyond survival. Your days were full of chores, not just to learn responsibility, but to keep your family alive. Firewood didn't gather itself, meals didn't cook on their own, and animals didn't wait patiently to be tended. You weren't learning life skills, you were life support. And it wasn't like there was a gentle transition either. There was no first steps, first chores chart, stuck to a wooden wall with a cute little star system. One day, someone older simply handed you a broom, or a basket, or a blunt knife and said, "Go." That was it. You were in the workforce now. By age 5 or 6, most peasant children could milk animals, haul water, sweep ashes, and babysit their younger siblings, not because it was adorable, but because if they didn't, something didn't get done. And if something didn't get done, people suffered. You weren't helping. You were necessary. And for noble children, the ones living in big stone homes with tapestries and trained tutors, their version of play wasn't exactly recess either. By the time a noble child could stand properly, they were already being trained to stand correctly. Posture, tone of voice, etiquette, every move was a preparation for adulthood. Boys practiced sword forms with wooden weapons, not for fun, but because they were expected to be soldiers before their voices changed. Girls practiced bowing, sitting, smiling, and managing households they wouldn't own until marriage contracts were signed, usually without their consent. Even games, if you could call them that, were rehearsals for roles, war games, courtly dramas, mock feasts. If you laughed too loudly or fell out of character, you got scolded or, worse, punished. Joy wasn't encouraged. Discipline was. Back in the villages, things weren't much softer. You didn't get weekends. You didn't get holidays unless it was a church feast day. And even then, you were probably cleaning up after it. The work was constant, seasonal, and endless. Spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvesting, winter not dying. There were no lazy Sundays, just days where the frost made the water too hard to carry, so you started later and worked faster. And while modern childhood has all kinds of protective language around emotional needs, safe environments, developmental stages, none of that applied here. If you cried, you were told to stop being weak. If you hesitated, you were scolded for being slow. If you got sick, that was unfortunate but not uncommon. Life moved on. The family needed hands, not feelings. And if you're thinking, okay, sure, but what about the really little kids? Didn't babies get doted on at least? Sort of. For the first few months of life, infants were watched over, mostly because infant mortality was so high. Everyone lived in fear of losing them, but affection was restrained. Many families avoided even naming their children until they were older, sometimes not until the child passed age 5. Why? Because they were too afraid to get attached to someone who might not survive the winter. There were exceptions, of course, stories of kind parents, sweet lullabies, mothers who rocked their babies to sleep despite the aching in their backs. But those stories are rare because survival stories were the default. Kindness was a bonus, not a baseline. And when you were tired, truly, deeply exhausted after a day of sunburns, blisters, bruises, and boredom, you didn't collapse into a soft bed with stuffed animals and a lullaby soundtrack. You crawled into straw-real, itchy, dusty, possibly bug-infested straw. You wrapped yourself in a coarse wool blanket, hoped rats didn't bite your toes, and tried to sleep while your parents whispered about debts, droughts, or the neighbor's sudden fever. There was no bedtime story, just silence and aching limbs. And no matter how young you were, no one ever said, "You've done enough," because enough didn't exist. Not in a world where every day was a fight against hunger, cold, illness, and taxes. So yeah, maybe you imagine medieval kids running barefoot through meadows, laughing under the sun. And maybe, just maybe, that happened once in a while. But most of the time, they were working, they were exhausted, and they were still expected to do more tomorrow. If you're picturing little medieval kids with backpacks heading off to school in the morning, stop. That didn't happen. Because unless you were the child of a noble, a monk, or incredibly lucky, school simply wasn't part of your reality. In fact, for most kids in the Middle Ages, the only thing you were expected to study was whatever your parents did. And you didn't need books for that, just eyes, hands, and the ability to keep up without complaining. Reading, optional. Writing, unheard of. Tuition, free. Because no one was teaching you anything in a classroom. Instead, your education came in the form of repetition. You learned by watching, by copying, by doing over and over and over. If your father was a blacksmith, congratulations. You'd be hammering metal before your arms were strong enough to lift the tools. If your mother spun wool, you'd be twisting fibers until your fingers ached. And no one asked if you were interested. Interest didn't matter. Curiosity was a luxury. You were being trained to survive, and survival didn't come with electives. There were no future career paths. Your path was chosen the moment you were born. Your name, your trade, your fate all inherited. In peasant families, boys learned from fathers, girls from mothers. Farming, baking, tanning leather, weaving baskets, brewing beer. If your parents did it, you would too. There were no certifications, no exams, just the expectation that you'd eventually become a carbon copy of whoever raised you. Not because they lacked imagination, but because deviation was dangerous. Trying something new meant risk, and risk was for people who could afford to fail. For most children, school wasn't missed. It simply wasn't imagined. The closest thing you got to formal learning was being yelled at when you did something wrong, and lessons were rarely gentle. Mistakes weren't teachable moments. They were just reasons to get hit with a wooden spoon or worse. You didn't get encouraging lectures. You got silence, side, eye, or swift correction. Why didn't anyone teach me this? Because you were supposed to just know, like magic or muscle memory. Now, if you were born into a noble or merchant family, things might look a little different. You might have a private tutor, not a cheerful patient educator, but a stern man in robes who taught you Latin and reminded you constantly that your family paid too much for you to be this slow. For noble boys, education focused on law, religion, and politics, things that help maintain power. Girls, their education involved embroidery, dancing, and learning how to politely keep quiet in public. Not exactly empowering, but hey, at least it came with parchment. If your family had ties to the church, maybe you got sent to a monastery school. That meant prayers at dawn, chanting scripture, copying texts, and hours of silence broken only by your own confusion. It wasn't Hogwarts. It was repetition and obedience. And again, only a tiny, privileged few got that chance. For everyone else, the idea of school was about as distant as the moon. And books? Don't even start. Most homes didn't have a single one, not even for decoration. Books were handwritten, chained to shelves, and cost more than your entire yearly income. So when people say education is power, they're right. And in medieval times, that power was hoarded. Literacy was like gold. The church guarded it, nobles rationed it, and peasants, they were expected to live and die without ever needing it. But still, children learned just not what we'd call academic knowledge. They learned how to spot a sick animal by its walk, how to tell the weather from the wind, how to balance a basket on your back without tipping, how to avoid the Lord's tax collector, how to lie convincingly when asked about missing eggs. Street smarts? Yes. Book smarts? Not a chance. So, no, there wasn't a school bell, but there was a rooster. And when it crowed, you got up not to learn about the world, but to help keep it moving. And you did that every day, without complaint, without rest, without recess. Because if you didn't, someone else, someone bigger, would remind you why you should have. If you think getting sick today is annoying, try catching a cold in the 1300s. No clinics, no Tylenol, no pediatrician calling you champ. Just a leaky roof, a drafty room, and someone waving burning herbs near your face while whispering prayers in Latin. Because in the Middle Ages, getting sick wasn't an inconvenience. It was a threat. And if you were a child, that threat was constant and terrifying. You see, back then, nobody really knew what germs were. There were no microscopes, no soap commercials, no scientific consensus. Illness was explained using 4 mysterious fluids called humors, or blamed on bad air, angry gods, or your neighbor's evil thoughts. And unfortunately, none of those explanations came with cures that worked. A child with a fever wasn't seen as a mild concern. A fever was a warning, a shadow, a countdown. Because once your body started acting up, sweating too much, coughing too hard, or going quiet, and the adults around you didn't say, "It'll pass." They said, "Start praying." Common colds weren't so common when your house had no insulation, no clean water, and no real heat. You caught chills easily, and you didn't stay home from school because, remember, there was no school. You just kept working, shivering, coughing, until someone noticed you'd stopped moving. And that was just the beginning. Water sources were often polluted. You drank from wells shared with animals. Waste disposal was a polite term for just throw it somewhere and hope the rain takes it. Hygiene was minimal, not because people didn't care, but because they didn't understand what caused disease in the first place. Bathing was rare, toothbrushes were non-existent, and soap was expensive. Children shared beds, spoons, food, and of course, germs. So when one child got sick, others followed fast. And even simple illnesses turned serious. A sore throat could become scarlet fever. A stomach ache could mean dysentery. A mild cut on your foot could rot your leg. Antibiotics hadn't been invented. Bandages were usually just dirty rags. Doctors, if you could even find one, offered treatments like bleeding, leeches, and balancing the humors, which often meant making the patient sicker. And guess who usually didn't even get to see the doctor? Children, especially poor children. They were low on the priority list. If help came, it came late, if at all. So most of the time, families just waited. You wrapped the child in wool, gave them herbs, whispered prayers, and hoped. That was the treatment plan. Step 1, wait. Step 2, pray. Step 3, bury. Because death was familiar, too familiar. Some historians estimate that in certain places, up to half of all children died before the age of 5. Half. Not from dramatic things, not dragons or curses, but from things modern kids don't even miss school over. Diarrhea, ear infections, teething fevers, or untreated infections from a splinter. And the worst part? It was so common that people adjusted emotionally. Parents loved their children, yes, but they often didn't get too attached too early. Some waited months, even years, before giving their child a proper name. Because why name something you might lose before spring? It sounds cold, but it was survival. And when epidemics came, as they often did, they didn't care about age. Plague, pox, measles, influenza, they swept through entire villages, leaving behind silence. There were no vaccines, no contact tracing, no hospitals with plastic wristbands and cartoons on the ceiling. Just panic, then grief. Imagine being 6 years old and watching your siblings fade out one by one. Imagine being a mother holding your feverish baby and knowing that there was nothing you could do except wait for the crying to stop. That was the medical system. Even among the nobility, where people had more food, better shelter, and access to doctors, children still died young. Because no one was safe from bad air, bad luck, and bacteria that no one knew existed. Gold didn't make you immune. It just gave you nicer linens to be buried in. And there was no such thing as mental health. No counseling after loss. No understanding of trauma. A child who survived smallpox and lost 3 siblings in a year was expected to keep working, to smile at feasts, to be grateful. You didn't get time to grieve. You got chores. So when we talk about how tough medieval childhood was, this is what we mean. It wasn't just the labor. It wasn't just the poverty. It was the constant, quiet presence of death, hovering, waiting, occasionally knocking. Childhood wasn't a promise. It was a gamble. And for most medieval kids, if you're listening to this right now, chances are you've already outlived most medieval children. That's not an exaggeration. That's just statistics. Because in the Middle Ages, surviving childhood was a miracle, not an expectation. And making it to age 5, that was the medieval version of graduating college with honors. You beat the odds. You won the game that most never finished. Let's look at the numbers. In some regions of medieval Europe, 30 to 50% of children died before their 5th birthday. Not from war or famine, though those certainly didn't help, but from everyday things. Fevers, infections, malnutrition, falling into a fire pit, drinking bad water, being left in a field too long, or simply not waking up. The line between alive and gone was razor thin, and no one ever felt truly safe. A baby might be born healthy, squirming, loud, and still be gone by morning. A toddler might chase a chicken across the yard and vanish the next week from a stomach bug. Even strong children, The sturdy ones could be taken by a bad winter or a weak harvest. And when one child got sick, it rarely stayed with one. Families lived close, huddled together in cramped cottages with smoke-stained ceilings and dirt floors. When disease came in, it came for everyone, and it didn't care how young you were. The result? Parents, especially mothers, developed a quiet form of guarded love. They cared, they held, they sang, but many didn't name their children right away. Some waited weeks, others waited years. Because naming something made it real, and losing something real hurt more. It was safer, emotionally, to hope quietly than to celebrate too soon. Even the language reflected this fragility. In some records, babies were referred to as little ones who may not stay. Death wasn't a surprise. It was part of the rhythm. And when children did survive, people didn't throw parties. They gave thanks cautiously because the journey was far from over. Illness didn't stop at age 5. Neither did hunger, or accidents, or plague, or war. You made it through the hardest part, yes, but the next part was still brutal. What made this worse was the lack of control. Parents did what they could, wrapped their children in wool, fed them broth, prayed, sang lullabies, but deep down, they knew it wasn't enough. Medicine, as we know it today, didn't exist. The best healers were often midwives or herbalists with limited tools, no training, and a lot of hope. And when things went wrong, families were left not just with grief, but with guilt. Did I forget a blessing? Did I anger a saint? Should I have burned more sage? Should I have prayed harder? Imagine carrying that weight. And this didn't just affect peasants. Noble families buried children too. In fact, they sometimes recorded births not in joy, but in fear, bracing for bad news. Royal tombs across Europe are filled with names history never remembered. Tiny coffins, carved angels the silence of potential never reached. So if you ever feel like you haven't accomplished much by age 20, remember, in the Middle Ages, you'd already be considered a survivor. You'd be congratulated for still breathing, still walking, still being here. And that's something people often forget when they romanticize the past. The castles, the costumes, the candlelight, none of that mattered if you didn't make it past infancy. Childhood wasn't whimsical. It was a test, and most didn't pass. There are no songs about them, no statues, no records, just soft footprints in the earth. And maybe, just maybe, a mother who remembered the sound of their laugh and whispered it once before sleep. So yes, being a child in the Middle Ages meant working hard. It meant no school, no toys, no safety. But before any of that, it meant surviving. And that in itself was a full-time job. So far, we've mostly talked about peasant children. And fair enough, they had it rough. But what about noble kids? The ones born in castles, wrapped in velvet, surrounded by tutors and candlelight? Well, they didn't have it easy either. They just suffered differently. You see, being born into nobility didn't buy you a childhood. It bought you expectations. From the moment a noble child took their first breath, they weren't just someone's son or daughter. They were a political asset, a potential alliance, a walking family reputation. And that meant everything they did, from how they sat, to how they spoke, to how they smiled, was watched, judged, and trained into submission. For boys, childhood ended early, very early. By the age of 7, noble boys were often sent away, not for school, but to serve as pages in another noble household. Not a vacation, not a summer camp, more like a 7-year-long internship with armor polishing and speech training. You learned manners, sword play, horse care, religion, Latin, archery, and how to bow just the right amount, not too low, that's desperate, not too high, that's rude. Every day was correction. Every mistake was a lesson, and not always a gentle one. And if you were clumsy, or slow, or too soft-spoken, someone reminded you that weakness was dangerous because someday you'd be a knight, a commander, a landholder. There was no room for softness, no room for fear. Now, noble girls, their path was different but no less restrictive. From birth, girls were trained for marriage, not love, not partnership marriage. And marriage meant being quiet, beautiful, obedient, and useful, in that order. By age 5 or 6, noble girls were learning embroidery, music, religious recitation, and how to walk without making noise. You think walking quietly is easy? Try doing it in heavy skirts while balancing a book on your head. If you spilled ink on your gown, or tripped in front of a guest, or laughed too loudly, someone took note. You were being watched, always. And the reason for all this training? To prepare you to be given away. Most noble girls were betrothed by age 12, married by 14, mothers by 16. Not because they were ready, but because that's what the family needed. Because again, you weren't a person. You were a contract, a connection, a dowry in motion. And don't assume that noble kids got privacy, either. They didn't have bedrooms full of books and soft lighting. Most shared quarters with attendants, nurses, tutors, and sometimes siblings. Your emotions weren't private. Your outbursts weren't forgiven. You were expected to behave with poise even when your teeth hurt, your dress itched, or your favorite dog died last night and no one cared. And if you stepped out of line, you didn't get sent to your room. You got shamed publicly, because nobles didn't just raise children, they raised symbols. And a flawed symbol was a family embarrassment. Now, you might be thinking, well, at least they had food, right? And beds? Sure, the meals were better, the walls less drafty, but that came at a cost. You ate under scrutiny. You dressed under supervision. You couldn't run barefoot in the grass or climb a tree without someone saying, "That's not proper." You couldn't cry too loudly, laugh too hard, or say what you really thought. You were never alone, and yet often felt isolated, because while peasant kids had freedom of movement, even if it came with hardship, noble kids had everything except freedom. You couldn't choose who you were. You were born into a role, and that role became your skin. Some rebelled, some withdrew, some became excellent actors, but most simply adapted, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. And as they grew older, the stakes grew higher. A noble boy who embarrassed his house could ruin a marriage alliance. A noble girl who spoke out of turn could cost her family a title. Everything came back to appearance, control, legacy. So yes, noble children had softer beds, but they also had sharper expectations. And while peasant kids were being broken by labor, noble kids were being shaped by pressure, every day, in every action, like clay forced into a mold carved centuries before they were born. No one asked what they wanted. No one cared if they were afraid. They were born to serve something bigger than themselves, a family name, a crest, a kingdom. So when you picture a little prince in velvet or a young lady dancing in the great hall, remember, behind the manners, the lace, and the smiles was a child trained to be perfect or perish trying. Because in the Middle Ages, even privilege came with a price. By today's standards, 12 is barely middle school. In the Middle Ages, it might be your wedding day. Because for medieval children, especially girls, marriage wasn't a milestone of love. It was a transaction, a duty, a timeline decided by adults who rarely asked what you thought. In noble families, marriage was less about romance and more about strategy. You didn't fall in love, you were positioned. From as early as age 7, children were betrothed, not engaged, like a modern couple posting on Instagram. No legally promised, often to someone they'd never met, based entirely on land, power, dowry, or peace treaties. By 12, you could be married. By 14, expected to bear children, and no one paused to ask, are they ready? Because ready didn't matter. Biology and family benefit were the only prerequisites. If you were a noble daughter, your worth was measured in acres and alliances. Your beauty was described in ledgers, your dowry discussed in whispers behind tapestries. And once a match was made, that was it. You were packed, shipped, and paraded, usually to a stranger's castle, to begin your new life as wife, mother, and silent ornament. No goodbye parties, no cake, just obligation. And if you were lucky, your husband was only twice your age. But it wasn't just the nobility. Among peasants, early marriage was also common, for different reasons. You weren't sealing political alliances, but you were securing help, more hands on the farm, more bodies in the field. And children? The sooner you started, the sooner they could start working too. For poor families, a daughter was a liability until she was married. That meant one less mouth to feed and potentially a small dowry in return. So yes, if the blacksmith's son showed interest, parents moved fast. Marriage was business. Emotions were secondary, if considered at all. And what about the children themselves? Well, most didn't have much to say in the matter. Some had no idea they were even engaged until the ceremony preparations began. One day you're helping your mother stir the soup. The next, she's braiding your hair and explaining how to address your new husband, who's 27, owns 2 goats, and doesn't smile much. You learn to adapt, or at least pretend to. And for boys, it was only marginally better. Young noble boys might be promised in marriage before they even knew what the word meant. And when the time came, they were expected to take on adult roles, household management, land oversight, military obligation, long before their voices settled into adulthood. No one eased you into responsibility. You went from playing with a carved wooden horse to managing actual horses, staff, tenants, and in-laws. Marriage wasn't the end of childhood. It was the eraser of it. And while today's weddings are filled with emotion, celebration, and personal vows, medieval child marriages were often tense, quiet, and transactional. There were no long romantic walks, no slow dancing under candlelight, just negotiations, contracts, and the quiet pressure to not embarrass the family name. If love happened later, eventually, it was a fortunate accident. Most couples were strangers at first. Some remained that way. And the risk for girls was even greater. Young brides faced not only emotional strain but physical danger. Their bodies weren't ready for childbirth. Their minds weren't ready for motherhood. And yet, no one waited. If you bled, you could breed. And if you couldn't, you were whispered about, blamed, replaced, sometimes shamed into silence, other times sent back to your family as a faulty match. It wasn't just early marriage. It was early commodification. Children turned into tools of diplomacy, labor, or legacy. And once the papers were signed, there was no going back. You belonged legally, socially, and emotionally to someone else. Some children found kindness in their spouses. Others found cruelty. But all found one thing in common. No one asked what they wanted. Because in the medieval world, marriage wasn't about love. It was about lineage. It was about land. It was about control. And children, they were just the first pieces moved on the board. In the Middle Ages, parenting wasn't gentle. It wasn't patient, reflective, or supported by parenting books with pastel covers. It was loud, it was physical, and it came with a stick. Because back then, the phrase, "spare the rod, spoil the child," wasn't a proverb. It was a policy. Children were not seen as fragile, emotional beings in need of guidance. They were viewed as wild, sinful, unruly small adults with big faults that needed beating out of them. Discipline was considered a moral duty. If a child disobeyed, it wasn't bad behavior. It was disobedience to the natural order. And the solution? Pain. Corporal punishment wasn't questioned. It was expected. If you spilled something, you were smacked. If you spoke out of turn, you were slapped. If you disrespected an elder or were simply perceived to, a leather strap might help you remember your place. This wasn't considered abuse. It was considered love. Strange, isn't it? But in many households, a beating was interpreted as a parent caring enough to correct you. If no one hit you, maybe they'd already given up on you. There was even a popular idea that a child's soul was tied to their spine and that beatings could straighten it, morally and literally. Religious leaders preached it, teachers practiced it, parents repeated it, and it wasn't reserved for major offenses. Sometimes you got punished just for existing loudly, crying too much, running indoors, looking someone in the eye for too long potential reasons for a good, hard lesson. And unlike today, where punishment is usually limited to a timeout or the loss of screen time, medieval punishment came in creative forms. There was the birch rod, a bundle of twigs tied together and stored in plain sight. The whipping post in more public settings, the wooden spoon, the belt, the canial tools of instruction, sometimes even shoes or firewood or whatever was within reach. And then there was shaming, a favorite in schools and churches. Forget detention. In medieval classrooms, if you failed your Latin or misbehaved, you might be made to kneel on dried peas, wear a sign calling you a fool, or stand facing a wall for hours while the class recited scripture behind you. Humiliation wasn't a side effect. It was the method. Because the idea wasn't just to make you behave. It was to make you fear, to associate pain with disobedience, to ensure your body remembered even if your mind hadn't yet understood. And if that sounds brutal, remember it wasn't personal. Even good children got hit, even by loving parents. This was how things were done. The line between discipline and cruelty was thin, blurred, and rarely discussed. And what did this do to the children? Well, most of them learned quickly to keep their heads down, to be small, silent, obedient, to hide their emotions, their questions, their curiosity, because those things often led to consequences. Some became deeply anxious, others became hardened. But all learned the same lesson. Adults could hurt you, and no one would stop them, because no one thought they should. There were no child protection laws, no counseling services, no anonymous hotlines. There wasn't even a word for trauma in the way we understand it now. You didn't heal from punishment. You carried it. And the scary part? It didn't always stop when you became a teenager. In many homes, especially among the lower classes or strict religious communities, adult children, even those in their 20s, could still be punished by their elders. Respect was absolute. Hierarchy was sacred. And if you rebelled, if you ran, shouted, resisted, you weren't just a bad child. You were a threat to the order of things. Even in public, violence against children wasn't hidden. A boy slapped by his father at the market wasn't pitied. He was judged for needing it. A girl pulled by her ear in church wasn't shielded. She was expected to apologize. Children were not seen as needing protection. They were seen as needing control. And that's perhaps the most tragic part, because behind every strike, there might have been care. Behind every punishment, some sense of love. But it was filtered through a system that saw pain as purification and fear as virtue. So when we talk about medieval childhood, we can't just talk about hard labor or bad food. We have to talk about raised hands, raised voices, raised expectations, because in that world, Being a child wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. And you learned, quietly, painfully, that love didn't always feel like love. Today, we talk about childhood like it's sacred, a protected space, a time to grow, explore, mess up gently, and figure things out slowly. But in the Middle Ages, that concept didn't exist. There was no childhood in the way we understand it now. You weren't a category, you were a size. To most adults, a child was just a smaller, unfinished adultone who hadn't yet learned how to be useful, obedient, or silent. There was no pause between birth and responsibility, no soft space to discover who you were. You were born, named, eventually, and then expected to start acting like a person people could depend on. The idea that children have developmental phases? Modern. The medieval world didn't care about your emotional needs or self-expression. You didn't have feelings. You had chores. You had duties. And if you showed too much emotion, sadness, anger, joy, confusion, it was seen as immaturity at best, insolence at worst. You were trained, not raised. Everything around you, the adults, the church, the customs, treated you as someone on a fast track to adulthood. You dressed like a miniature version of your parents. You were expected to mimic adult speech, behavior, and beliefs. There was no space to question, no room to say, "I don't know yet." Even your play, when you had time for it, wasn't really yours. You played what adults approved of, games that trained your hands for work, or your posture for courtship, or your reflexes for war. You didn't make up fantasy worlds. You rehearsed for reality. And if you strayed, if you acted silly or too free for too long, someone reminded you firmly that you weren't a baby anymore, at 5 or 6, if they were generous. The church didn't help much, either. In many teachings, children were viewed as born sinful, flawed from the start. You didn't learn bad behavior. You were born with it. And the job of every adult was to train it out of you before it ruined your soul. Original sin wasn't just a theological idea. It was a parenting philosophy. So discipline came early and often. And that's why in art from the period, you'll rarely find depictions of children as playful or innocent. When they appear, they look odd small adults with wise eyes and stiff posture, because that's how society imagined them. Not as innocent beings becoming something, but as half-shaped citizens who just needed a few more inches and fewer mistakes. No birthday parties, no bedtime affirmations, just expectations. Even grief looked different. When children died, and many did, their passing wasn't always publicly mourned the way we would today. Not because families didn't care, but because the loss of a child was woven into life, common, frequent, and tragically, almost expected. To protect themselves, some parents held back affection until a child proved they would survive. Love became cautious, connection delayed. Childhood, emotionally, was put on layaway. And if you did survive, the reward wasn't freedom. It was more responsibility. By your early teens, you were either married, apprenticed, in the fields, or on the path to some adult role, ready or not. And if you struggled, too bad. You had no excuse. "I'm still learning. I'm not ready. I'm just a kid." None of those lines existed, because in their world, you weren't a kid. You were simply late to usefulness. And this mindset wasn't limited to peasants. Even in noble circles, children were dressed, trained, and posed like adults. Noble boys were young knights in training. Noble girls were ladies, in waiting. There was no in-between phase, no awkward age. Just hurry up and become who we need you to be. You weren't allowed to be messy, to explore identity, or to simply be, because who you were was never the point. It was always about who you were supposed to become. So while modern kids are told, "Take your time," medieval kids were told, Time is running out, and it was. With short life expectancies, constant danger, and high mortality, there was no space for self-discovery. The luxury of being unsure, that was for saints and scholars, not for you. You were either useful or forgotten. So when we romanticize the past, picture the castles, the pageantry, the candlelit halls, remember this: medieval children didn't get a childhood. They got a countdown. And every tick of that clock moved them closer to a role they didn't choose, in a life they weren't prepared for, under rules they weren't allowed to question. Because in their world, there were no children, only small people waiting to be tolerated, or punished, or used, and if they were lucky, remembered. Begging is often seen as a symptom of modern urban poverty, but in truth, it is one of the most ancient and persistent features of human civilization. Long before the rise of nation-states, structured economies, and welfare systems, there were beggars, individuals who lived by appealing to the generosity, guilt, or religious obligation of others. From the dusty streets of ancient Thebes to the bustling marketplaces of Rome, from the temples of Varanasi to the alleyways of Chang'an, the presence of beggars was a common sight, woven into the daily rhythms of society. In ancient Egypt, depictions of the poor and the lame can be found in tomb paintings and inscriptions, often framed within the broader idea of divine charity and moral duty. The concept of balance and justice was not only a cosmic principle but a social one. Giving to the needy was considered a righteous act, a way to maintain harmony. Yet, there is no evidence of state structures aimed at eradicating poverty. Instead, support for the destitute was informal and heavily reliant on religion and personal ethics. In ancient Greece, beggars had a more ambiguous role. On one hand, hospitality, xenia, was a sacred virtue, and those who refused to aid a supplicant might incur the wrath of the gods. On the other hand, the beggar was often associated with shame, idleness, or even trickery. In Homer's epics, beggars sometimes appear as disguised heroes or wandering strangers, testing the morality of hosts. This duality between divine messenger and social parasite followed the figure of the beggar throughout antiquity. In Rome, the situation grew more complex. The imperial city had a vast population and a widening wealth gap. While some forms of public assistance existed, such as grain distributions, annona, there was no comprehensive system for supporting the poor. Begging became a fixture of Roman life, particularly in temples, forums, and public baths. Some beggars were disabled veterans, others were children, the elderly, or widows with no family support. It was common for wealthier Romans to carry small coins specifically for almsgiving. Philosophers like Seneca wrote ambivalently about the poor, acknowledging their plight but often interpreting poverty as a spiritual trial or moral failure. Moving eastward, in ancient India, begging assumed a more institutionalized form, especially among religious mendicants. In Hindu and Jain traditions, asceticism was a respected path. Ambitious monks who lived off alms were considered spiritually elevated. The same held true in early Buddhism, where monks and nuns intentionally renounced possessions and relied on daily alms rounds as part of their spiritual discipline. These religious beggars were not seen as burdens but as vessels of merit. Giving to them was not charity but a spiritual investment with karmic rewards. However, this didn't erase the presence of non-religious beggars, those forced by hardship into lives of dependency. In ancient China, begging was both stigmatized and structurally tolerated. Confucian ideals emphasized order, hierarchy, and familial responsibility, and those without family were often viewed with suspicion. Nonetheless, imperial records acknowledge the presence of beggars, especially during times of famine, war, or dynastic collapse. The Han and Tang dynasties, for example, recorded mass migrations of displaced peasants, many of whom resorted to begging. In some cities, officials kept registers of beggars and occasionally provided food relief. Yet, social mobility was limited, and the label of a beggar, once applied, could follow someone for life. A recurring pattern across civilizations is that begging often flourished not simply due to personal failure, but because of systemic breakdowns, warfare, famine, economic collapse, or political upheaval. When the basic support structures of society failed, large populations were thrust into the margins. Beggars became a visible symptom of deeper social fractures. At the same time, beggars were often paradoxical figures, marginal yet ever-present, shunned yet needed. In many ancient cultures, they were seen as spiritually significant agents of karma, reminders of mortality, or even disguised deities. They occupied a strange social limbo, both real and symbolic. Their presence challenged moral norms, social boundaries, and even power structures. Who owed what to whom? Was giving a duty or a choice? Could begging be honorable? In sum, begging in ancient times was not a monolithic or marginal anomaly. It was a complex, multivalent institution deeply embedded in religious beliefs, cultural practices, and social structures. Whether seen as victims, tricksters, spiritual seekers, or burdens, beggars were part of the moral architecture of ancient societies. Their stories may not be written in stone, but they echo through every corner of the ancient world. While begging is often seen today as a condition of desperation or misfortune, in many pre-modern societies, it took on a more complex and sometimes organized role. In feudal social systems, particularly those with rigid class hierarchies and limited economic mobility, begging occasionally evolved into a kind of profession, not a career by aspiration, but a recognizable, even semi-regulated position within the societal structure. It was a role both marginalized and strangely institutionalized. In medieval China, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties, there were reports of highly organized beggar guilds. These were not random street wanderers, but members of networks that had codes, leaders, and even geographic jurisdictions. In cities like Beijing or Nanjing, different districts were assigned to different beggar groups, who operated much like labor unions, except in reverse. These groups collected dues, enforced internal discipline, and dealt harshly with unauthorized beggars who tried to encroach on their territory. Within their ranks were distinct roles. Some posed as the blind or crippled, others performed street acts, while some handled coordination or collections. Far from being chaotic or disorganized, this was a structured sub-economy within the larger feudal society. Similar systems existed in parts of medieval India, where entire castes or communities were associated with mendicancy. In some cases, begging was not merely tolerated but ritualized. Certain Brahmin sects, for instance, accepted alms not out of poverty but as a sacred duty. Meanwhile, other groups excluded from landholding or formal labor begged as a communal occupation, passed down through generations. These communities might specialize in certain songs, stories, or performances while begging, making their presence a regular, if humble, part of village life. This was especially true in times or regions where the caste system rigidly dictated occupational boundaries, making social mobility nearly impossible. In Europe, especially in late medieval and early modern periods, begging too began to acquire an institutional face. The feudal structure left little room for economic self-determination among peasants, and many who lost their land due to war, crop failure, or enclosure policies, as in Tudor England, had no alternative but to beg. In cities, certain forms of begging were regulated by municipal authorities. Licensed beggars, often those considered the deserving poor, such as the elderly, disabled, or widowed, were allowed to solicit alms. Others, labeled as vagrants or sturdy beggars, faced punishment, imprisonment, or forced labor. This distinction between deserving and undeserving beggars reflected deeper moral and religious attitudes. Christian teachings emphasized charity as a virtue, but also warned against idleness and deceit. As a result, beggars had to perform a balancing act, presenting themselves as needy enough to deserve help, but not so idle as to offend social norms. Some took up quasi-theatrical tactics, wearing tattered robes, showcasing visible wounds, or carrying infants, real or fake. The performance of poverty became part of the profession. In Islamic societies, begging was likewise shaped by religious frameworks. Zakat, or almsgiving, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and helping the poor was seen as a sacred duty. However, this did not mean all beggars were equally respected. In cities across the Abbasid and later Ottoman empires, waqf, charitable endowments, were set up to manage support for the poor, including soup kitchens and shelters. Still, some beggars operated independently, often settling outside mosques or markets. Over time, these two formed informal networks, and some even used religious symbolism or recitations to encourage donations. What unites these varied cases is a central paradox. Begging was seen as both a sign of failure and a part of the social fabric. It was unwanted yet expected. In the absence of modern welfare states, societies had to absorb and manage poverty in alternative ways, and one such way was to make begging a tolerated and sometimes organized form of existence. Thus, while it may seem contradictory to call begging a profession in feudal contexts, it often behaved like one. It had methods, hierarchies, codes of conduct, and social recognition, however lowly. More importantly, it reveals how structured inequality and limited options could transform even survival itself into a systemic role. Beggars were not outside the system. They were the shadows that followed it, step by step. Throughout history, religions have shaped not only how people understand suffering and charity, but also how they perceive beggars themselves. In many ancient and pre-modern societies, the act of begging was not automatically seen as shameful or dishonorable. On the contrary, in some religious traditions, it held deep spiritual meaning, transforming the beggar into a symbol of humility, sacrifice, or divine connection. In Buddhism, for example, begging is not only accepted, but revered within the monastic path. The Buddha himself and his disciples practiced alms, rounds, pindapada, as a core spiritual discipline. Monks and nuns were to own no possessions, prepare no food, and live entirely off what was given to them freely. This dependence on the lay community fostered humility, detached the monastics from material craving, and allowed lay people to generate merit through generosity, dana. Importantly, the Buddhist monk was not a beggar in the modern sense. There was no pleading or pressure, only silent presence and acceptance. Giving was not transactional but karmic, a spiritual bridge between giver and receiver. Similarly, in Hinduism, certain ascetics known as sadhus or sannyasis adopt a life of renunciation, wandering from place to place and subsisting on alms. These individuals voluntarily withdraw from the cycle of worldly duties, wealth, and family ties to seek liberation, moksha. To give them food or coins was considered a pious act, aiding both parties in progressing towards spiritual freedom. Hindu mythology often contains stories where gods appear in disguise as beggars to test human compassion. Thus, refusing a beggar could be seen as refusing the divine itself. Jainism, perhaps more than any other religion, emphasizes extreme non-possession. Jain monks and nuns live lives of radical detachment, relying entirely on the lay community for sustenance. However, they follow strict codes even in alms-taking, refusing food if not freely offered or if taken with attachment. For Jains, the act of begging is not one of humiliation but of purification. It represents the ultimate surrender of ego and desire. In the Christian tradition, attitudes toward begging are more varied and evolved over time. In the early church, poverty was closely tied to piety. Jesus himself lived a simple life and taught his followers to give to the poor as an act of love and obedience to God. Saints and early monastic orders, like the Franciscans, embraced voluntary poverty, walking barefoot and living off alms to mirror Christ's humility. St. Francis of Assisi, for example, considered begging not just a necessity but a form of sacred dependence. However, by the late medieval period, especially in Europe, the rise of urban populations and mass poverty created tensions. While Christian doctrine still taught the virtue of almsgiving, the Church also began categorizing the poor into deserving and undeserving. The former included widows, orphans, the sick, and the disabled, those seen as victims of fate. The latter included those perceived as lazy, deceitful, or morally corrupt. Begging, once seen as spiritually valid, became more morally suspect unless backed by clear suffering. Nevertheless, religious institutions continued to run almshouses and poor relief programs as part of their moral duty. In Islam, the concept of zakat, mandatory almsgiving, is one of the 5 pillars of faith. Every able Muslim is required to give a portion of their wealth to those in need. Begging in this context is not necessarily shameful, but neither is it encouraged unless truly necessary. Prophet Muhammad himself advised against habitual begging, saying that the upper hand, giving, is better than the lower hand, receiving. However, for those in genuine hardship, the Quran affirms that assistance should be given without judgment or humiliation. The recipient's dignity is protected, and the act of giving becomes a form of spiritual purification for the giver. Across all these traditions, one truth remains: begging is never only about hunger. It is also about human vulnerability, spiritual humility, and the social fabric that binds communities together. In religious thought, the beggar is not just someone in need, but someone who offers others the chance to do good, to transcend ego, and to fulfill sacred duties. Thus, far from being marginalized, the beggar, especially the religious mendicant, was often placed near the spiritual center of society. Their presence posed a challenge not only to individual generosity, but to collective values. They asked not just for bread, but for meaning. Not all forms of begging are created equal. While the public often views beggars as victims of circumstance, history reveals a far more complex picture, one where begging was sometimes a spiritual choice, a social role, or even a personal philosophy. Understanding the distinction between voluntary begging and forced begging is crucial to interpreting the deeper meanings behind this ancient and persistent human condition. Voluntary begging was a chosen path. In many spiritual traditions, individuals deliberately chose to beg not out of economic desperation, but as an act of renunciation. These were voluntary mendicants, people who gave up material possessions and social status in pursuit of spiritual or philosophical goals. Rather than being cast out by society, they often operated within respected frameworks of religious asceticism. Buddhist monks are a well-known example. They vow to live without personal possessions, including food, and collect daily alms as a form of spiritual discipline. The act of accepting alms is as important for the giver as for the receiver. In this context, begging is neither degrading nor accidental. It is intentional and even noble. Similarly, in Hinduism, certain ascetics known as sadhus or bhikshus voluntarily remove themselves from worldly life. Their lives of wandering and alms collection symbolized detachment from ego and material desire. Even in early Christianity, figures like Saint Francis of Assisi embraced holy poverty, choosing a life of begging to imitate the life of Christ. What unites these cases is choice. The beggar in these instances is not without alternatives. They are choosing a path that uses vulnerability as a form of spiritual leverage. Their lack is not due to loss, but to intentional abandonment. In contrast, forced begging emerges from the absence of choice. It arises when individuals are pushed into the streets by external forces, war, famine, systemic inequality, or personal catastrophe. These beggars do not reject material life. They are rejected by it. They lack land, kin, security, and often dignity. Their begging is not a statement of philosophy, but a last resort. Ancient societies produced such beggars in large numbers. During times of famine in China or India, mass migrations of displaced peasants flooded cities where they had no means of support. In medieval Europe, widows, orphans, and the disabled often had no other way to survive. In these cases, begging was a survival mechanism, not a calling. In more recent history, especially under colonial regimes or exploitative systems, forced begging has also taken more sinister forms. Children, particularly, have been exploited, coerced into begging by criminal networks or impoverished families. In such cases, begging is not just involuntary, it's institutionalized suffering. The person begging is used as a tool, stripped of agency entirely. Even in ancient societies, there were attempts to distinguish between these categories. In medieval Christian Europe, terms like deserving and undeserving poor were coined to differentiate the helpless from the idle. Though the distinction was flawed and often moralizing, it reflected an awareness that not all begging stemmed from the same cause. Sometimes, however, the line between voluntary and forced begging blurs. A monk may renounce wealth, but what happens if no one gives? A widow may claim spiritual purpose in her suffering, but is that purpose a choice or a coping mechanism? History does not always make this distinction clear. In the end, what defines voluntary versus forced begging is not appearance but agency. Did the person choose this path out of conviction, or was it chosen for them by poverty, politics, or fate? Understanding this difference is vital. It helps us avoid overgeneralization, challenge our assumptions, and see beggars not just as passive recipients of pity, but as individuals with histories, beliefs, and often deeply personal reasons for being where they are. Beggars have long held a powerful place in the imagination of civilizations, not just as figures of pity, but as symbols, messengers, and often mirrors reflecting the deeper truths of society. In literature, mythology, and oral tradition across the world, the beggar is rarely just a hungry person asking for food. Instead, they often appear as enigmatic characters who blur the line between loneliness and wisdom, weakness and power, invisibility and insight. In Eastern traditions, particularly in Chinese literature and folklore, beggars are sometimes depicted as disguised sages or outcasts possessing hidden virtue. One of the most famous examples is Ji Gong, a Buddhist monk from the Southern Song dynasty who dressed in rags, begged for food and wine, and acted erratically, but who was believed to possess miraculous powers and deep compassion. Though the establishment saw him as a disgrace, the common people revered him as a holy man in disguise. Ji Gong became a cultural archetype, the mad monk, whose poverty concealed divine wisdom. Another recurring theme in Chinese stories is the motif of emperors or nobles disguising themselves as beggars to test the morality of the common people or officials. These stories invert power structures. The beggar is the true king, and how others treat him reveals their virtue or vice. In Indian epics, too, beggars appear as liminal figures. In the Mahabharata, The hero Arjuna disguises himself as a wandering ascetic during exile, gaining both humility and clarity. Meanwhile, beggars also appear in stories about karma and fate, sometimes as people punished for past actions, other times as vehicles of spiritual challenge. Gods like Shiva are known to wander the world in disguise, appearing as poor beggars to test devotion. The act of giving to a beggar thus becomes more than charity. It is a chance to interact with the divine. In Western literature, beggars also carry symbolic weight. In Greek mythology, Homer's Odyssey features one of the earliest and most dramatic uses of the beggar disguise. Odysseus, returning home after 20 years, enters his own palace dressed as a beggar. In this humble form, he observes who among his household remains loyal. The disguise allows him to act with anonymity, humility, and eventually, righteous vengeance. The theme is clear. The beggar sees all and is not to be underestimated. Medieval European tales, especially within the Christian tradition, often portray beggars as Christ-like figures or as recipients of divine charity. Saints like Martin of Tours and Francis of Assisi are remembered for their kindness toward beggars, often giving away all they had. In these stories, the beggar is a test of the soul. How one treats them determines moral worth. At the same time, religious literature warned against false beggars or tricksters who exploited others' compassion, reflecting a complex moral tension between piety and suspicion. In folklore, beggars are sometimes the ones who grant blessings or curses, a common tale across cultures. A beggar comes to a village and is turned away by all but one humble person. The beggar then reveals their true nature, often a god, spirit, or angel, and rewards the kind while punishing the selfish. These stories reinforce the idea that appearances are deceptive and that compassion should never be withheld based on status. Even in modern literature, beggars persist as powerful symbols. In works like Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the suffering of the poor is central to a larger moral and social critique. Characters like Fantine and the Bishop, though not all beggars in the strict sense, represent the thin line between dignity and destitution. Their interactions with poverty serve to humanize and elevate those otherwise discarded by society. Ultimately, the beggar in literature and legend is rarely just a passive figure. They may be hidden royalty, divine messengers, tricksters, or truth-tellers. They occupy the threshold between worlds, rich and poor, sacred and profane, seen and unseen. In doing so, they challenge both characters and readers to confront their own assumptions about worth, dignity, and power. Through these enduring images, literature reminds us that the beggar's bowl may be empty, but their presence is full of meaning. Begging, though often treated as a private misfortune, has always been a powerful public mirror. In every era, the presence of beggars has revealed the cracks in a society's foundation, its inequalities, exclusions, and systemic failures. To understand the role of beggars in ancient and feudal societies is to confront the harsh realities of social stratification, where one person's survival often depended on another's abundance or indifference. In most pre-modern civilizations, social hierarchy was rigidly enforced. Class, caste, gender, and occupation were typically fixed by birth, and mobility was rare. The wealthy and powerful existed in sharp contrast to the working poor, and below them, those with no land, no lineage, or no role. The marginalized, including beggars. Their visibility in public spaces made them impossible to ignore. They served as both a symptom and a warning that beneath the rituals of order, injustice festered. In feudal Europe, for example, lords owned the land while peasants labored under heavy obligations. Those who lost access to land due to war, famine, or legal dispossession often had nowhere to turn but the streets. As towns expanded, so did the number of beggars. many of whom were former peasants displaced by economic change or enclosure laws. These were not idlers by choice, but victims of a transformation they could not control. Their presence challenged the image of a stable Christian kingdom, raising uncomfortable questions about wealth, mercy, and responsibility. Likewise, in India's caste-based society, those born into lower castes or outside the caste system altogether, Dalits, were frequently denied access to land, education, or temple spaces. Many survived through menial labor, while others turned to begging not as a preference, but as a socially enforced destiny. Their poverty was not accidental, but institutional. Even religious justifications for inequality, such as karma or purity laws, often mask the brutal reality of exclusion. To beg was not merely to lack food, but to be denied dignity. In imperial China, Confucian ideals emphasized harmony and hierarchy, but this often meant prioritizing order over compassion. The state occasionally offered famine relief or temporary shelter for the poor, but these systems were inconsistent and limited. During times of crisis, dynastic collapse, war, or environmental disaster, millions were displaced, and begging surged. Yet, many elites viewed beggars as dangerous, morally deficient, or disruptive to social order. They were punished, relocated, or pushed further to the margins. Their suffering was visible proof that the system failed its weakest, but often the system refused to acknowledge that truth. In many cultures, charity became a way to ease that discomfort. Giving alms soothed individual guilt but rarely addressed the root causes of poverty. Institutions like almshouses, soup kitchens, or temple donations provided temporary relief, but they also helped maintain the status quo. The presence of beggars reminded the wealthy of their duty to give, but not necessarily to change the structures that produced inequality in the first place. Moreover, beggars often existed outside the legal framework. Without property, family, or official identity, they were excluded from many civic protections. They were present in cities but not fully part of them, seen but not heard, and yet their very existence posed a kind of resistance. By living visibly in the margins, they forced society to confront its boundaries. Who belongs? Who is protected? Who is left behind? Some beggars use this visibility strategically. In literature and folklore, they appear not just as helpless figures, but as witnesses, critics, or even avengers of injustice. Their ragged bodies became canvases upon which society's failures were written. In this sense, begging was not only survival, it was a silent accusation. In the end, begging in ancient and feudal societies cannot be separated from the systems that created it. It was the shadow of privilege, the residue of conquest, and the voice of the unheard. Beggars stood at the lowest rung of society, but from that ground, they revealed how the entire ladder was built. At the heart of the discourse on begging lies a complex moral question. When someone chooses a life of begging, are they surrendering to fate or deliberately rejecting the values of mainstream society? This question challenges the common assumption that all beggars are simply victims. Instead, it asks us to consider a deeper possibility, that for some, begging may be not just a necessity but a philosophical choice, even a form of freedom. Throughout history, there have always been individuals who willingly stepped outside the conventional systems of work, property, and productivity, choosing instead to live on the margins. These individuals were often religious ascetics, spiritual seekers, or social dissenters. Their choice to beg was not a result of desperation, but an intentional break with materialism, hierarchy, and control. In Buddhism, for example, monks and nuns renounce worldly possessions and rely entirely on alms. This is not an act of helplessness, but a disciplined path toward enlightenment. By depending on others for food and shelter, they cultivate humility, sever ties to ego, and challenge the illusion of self-sufficiency. The choice to beg is a means of spiritual purification. Similarly, in traditions like Hinduism and Jainism, renunciants live as wandering ascetics, embracing poverty as a tool for transcendence. Their status as beggars is not pitiful but revered. The act of begging becomes a kind of ritual, a symbolic rejection of worldly attachments. In their eyes, to own nothing is not a failure. It is a form of power. Even outside of religion, some historical figures have chosen marginality as a form of protest or resistance. Philosophers like Diogenes, the Cynic, lived in poverty, begged for food, and challenged the social norms of ancient Athens. His life was a public critique of greed, pretense, and artificial status. He begged not because he lacked options, but because he wanted to expose the absurdity of those who clung to wealth and title. In such cases, begging becomes something else entirely. It becomes a statement. It says, "I refuse to participate in your system. I value something different." In this light, choosing to beg is not resignation, but rebellion. Yet, this raises another question. How do we tell the difference? When does begging express agency? And when is it simply a mask for suffering? In the real world, these lines are blurry. A woman who loses her home may claim spiritual clarity in her new life. But is that belief a conscious embrace or a way to cope with trauma? A man who begs in the name of philosophy may still suffer cold and hunger. Is freedom still freedom if it hurts? This moral ambiguity has long haunted both the beggars themselves and the societies that witness them. On one hand, those who choose to beg challenge our notions of success, dignity, and productivity. They provoke discomfort. If they are free, what does that say about us? On the other hand, romanticizing poverty can be dangerous. It risks ignoring real suffering and, worse, blaming the poor for their own hardship. The truth is, not all beggars choose, and not all choices are equal. Some choose because they are driven by faith, principle, or vision. Others choose because all other doors have closed. And some live in the space between, neither fully free nor fully forced, but surviving on what is left. Ultimately, this moral question does not have a clean answer, but it reminds us to approach beggars not with pity or suspicion, but with awareness and humility. Each person on the street may carry a story we do not see, a story of loss, conviction, or quiet resistance. Their presence urges us to ask not only what they are doing, but what we are avoiding. Is begging a defeat, or is it a choice to live differently? Perhaps the answer depends less on them and more on how we choose to see them. Begging, often dismissed as a symptom of failure or misfortune, is in fact a complex reflection of human history, culture, and moral philosophy. Across civilizations, from ancient India to medieval Europe, beggars have occupied a unique position, marginal yet ever-present, pitied yet powerful in symbol. Through this exploration, we've seen that begging was not always an act of desperation. Sometimes it was a chosen path, rooted in spiritual conviction or philosophical resistance. Other times, it was the final option for those cast out by war, poverty, or rigid social structures. Beggars existed at the intersection of injustice and belief, of economic collapse and moral responsibility. They were not only recipients of charity, but also silent challengers of privilege. Their presence exposed the fault lines of stratified societies and called into question the fairness of inherited systems. And in literature and legend, beggars became vessels of meaning, testing characters, delivering truths, or embodying divine presence in disguise. Ultimately, the figure of the beggar forces us to ask enduring questions. What does it mean to give, to need, to choose poverty, to be seen or unseen by society? In every era, begging tells us more than we expect, not just about those who beg, but about those who watch, judge, or ignore. And so the beggar remains, not just on the street, but in our stories, in our ethics, and in our collective memory. A quiet figure asking for more than just alms, asking perhaps for understanding. Close your eyes. You're standing in a cool, underground chamber, lit by the wavering light of a single torch. The walls are damp. Something drips softly in the background, hopefully water. Before you stands a statue carved from pale limestone, weathered by centuries but remarkably intact. She's not tall, maybe 5 feet if she stood free. Her robes, once imperial, now ripple in stone like frozen fabric in a forgotten wind. And her face, it's not the face of a goddess, not the serenity of the Virgin Mary, not the blank calm of ancient kings. No, this is a face you might see in a moment of pure, personal terror. Her eyes are open wide, not with awe, but with something very close to panic. Her mouth isn't closed in silent grace. It's parted just slightly, as if the sculptor froze her the instant before she screamed. This isn't idealized beauty. This is unfortunate realism. You begin to notice the tiny lines near the eyes, the tension carved into the lips, the sharp downturn of the brows. A human face, not worshipped, not exalted, just recorded, trapped. Now, this might not be alarming if we were in a modern museum. Maybe it's an artistic statement. Maybe the sculptor was a tortured genius. But we're not in a museum. We're in a mass burial site beneath a ruined chapel, somewhere on the edges of medieval Thebes. The ceiling overhead is held together by faith and moisture. The inscription near the statue's base is half erased, but someone, centuries ago, tried to translate it. The chalk reads, "She saw, she knew, she waits." Very comforting. Now, here's where it gets medieval. Carving statues in your image wasn't something ordinary people got. If your face ended up in stone, chances are you were royalty, or a saint, or someone whose death needed to be remembered in great detail for political reasons. You know, pleasant things. But this woman, we'll call her the lady, doesn't carry any of those vibes. There's no crown, no halo, no symbols of martyrdom. There's just expression, intense, emotional, deeply uncomfortable expression. So the question stands, why would a medieval sculptor, trained to glorify nobles and immortalize saints, carve a woman in the act of suffering? Theories, of course, abound. Maybe she was a prisoner, a noblewoman accused of heresy. Maybe she spoke Latin too fluently or owned a cat. Maybe she bled on the wrong day and someone thought she was a witch. In medieval Europe, those were all solid paths to a creative death. Or maybe this is the fun version: she was a queen. Not a good one, of course. A dangerous one. The kind of queen that read books, wore trousers, or told a bishop to sit down. The kind who wielded power through whispers, who smiled when others slept. Maybe she saw too much, and the sculptor was ordered to remember her not as a figure of grace, but as a warning. This is what happens when women dream. But perhaps the most haunting detail isn't the fear. It's that the face looks unfinished, as if the sculptor stopped carving midway, not due to fatigue, but as if waiting for the real expression to reveal itself. One theory, whispered by the kind of archaeologist who drinks too much red wine alone, suggests the statue wasn't sculpted after death, but during, yes, live carving. There were rituals, obscure, lost to time, in which a living person, condemned or sacred, was turned into stone in memory before their body even went cold. The sculptor would watch them day after day, capturing each shift in expression as the final moment drew near, until the face solidified, not in marble, but in memory, then in stone. Medieval compassion, truly. And perhaps, if you look long enough into her eyes wide, unblinking, eternal you might catch something else. Not fear, not pain, but accusation. A trace of, you were not there. A silent, you forgot me. A barely carved, barely whispered, I waited. Of course, all of this could be conjecture. The statue might be misdated. The expression may be a trick of light and erosion. Maybe she was just a noblewoman with bad digestion. Maybe the artist had a sense of humor and this is medieval satire. But that's the thing with stone. It remembers what we forget. It waits when we move on. And it speaks not with words, but with silence shaped like a scream. So, sleep now, traveler, for she cannot. Not until someone, anyone, decides what her face really meant. And maybe, hopefully, it wasn't carved in your image. You've already seen her face. You've stood in that silence and felt the weight of 1,000 unsaid words pressed into stone. But now your eyes drift downward. You start to notice other things, subtler things, not features, but textures, not beauty, but damage. The gown she wears, if we dare call it that, is strange, not entirely regal, not entirely plain. It's draped in folds, as if once silk, now hardened into draped stone. It moves where fabric no longer does. And more importantly, it's wrong. Some pleats are precise, almost ceremonial, but others twist, like they were grabbed, yanked, crumpled by invisible hands. One shoulder is exposed, not elegantly, but as if cloth was torn away in a struggle and never smoothed back. And then there are the scratches. You lean closer. They aren't ornamental engravings. No pattern. No symmetrical flourish. Just thin, uneven lines along her arms, the sides of her ribs, even her throat. Faint but deliberate. A cluster at her side almost looks like fingernail marks. Or claws. But we had no dragons. At least not the literal kind. So, what are these? Option 1. They are ritual marks. Scars made holy by the hands of a priest. You see, medieval rituals weren't known for subtlety. Maybe this woman was part of a rite, a sacrifice. Maybe each scratch is a tally, one for every name she whispered or every secret she refused to give. Option 2. They're traces of violence, not sanctified, just forgotten. Maybe this isn't a statue of a revered queen, but the tomb marker of a woman condemned and killed. Maybe this is how executioners remembered their victims, not with names, but with gashes. Or option 3, the most unsettling of all. These marks weren't part of the statue originally. They were added after, by someone else. Someone who found her, someone who saw that exposed shoulder, the twisted robe, the open mouth, and thought, she still looks proud. So they scratched her. Scratched and scraped, until the grace chipped away, until even her dignity was uneven. A final punishment, a petty mutilation, vandalism across centuries. Medieval spite, the only thing more durable than stone. And now you see the belt. It isn't ornate, but it's tight, cinched around the waist so tightly that the stone beneath it bulges slightly, as if under pressure. Almost like the sculptor wanted you to feel the discomfort, or like the model herself had trouble breathing. There's a sigil on the belt, almost too faded to read, a serpent wrapped around a branch. Not a common crest, not royal, not holy, perhaps personal, perhaps forbidden. Her sleeves are uneven. One hangs lower. On the longer sleeve, a buckle is carved in perfect detail, but it's not clasped. It's half undone, a symbol of escape, seduction, or interruption. Now, lower, near the hem, you see burn marks. Yes, even on stone, char, ash. Someone tried to set this statue on fire. The burns didn't destroy. Its stone doesn't burn, but the attempt left. Soot, blackened cracks, and a smell that never quite goes away. like wet iron and regret. So why burn a statue? Because it looked too alive? Because it remembered what others wished it didn't? Because someone, long ago, looked into her face and said, "She knows." They couldn't silence her, so they scorched her. Now, let's ask the dangerous question. Are these marks evidence or messages? Did the sculptor mean for us to see all this, the asymmetry, the exposed skin, the distorted elegancy as clues? Or are we just making meaning where there is none? Was this woman royal, condemned, or just a model? Was she honored, hunted, forgotten? Or maybe she's none of those things. Maybe she was you in another time, trapped between rebellion and ritual, between memory and stone. But don't worry, there's nothing left to fear. She can't feel it anymore. Probably. Now take a step back. No, not metaphorically. We mean it. Step back from the statue. You've seen the face, the dress, the marks. But you haven't asked one question. Where is she? Not just in a dark room, not just behind iron gates and dusty air. She's standing in the wrong place. Let us explain. This is not a chapel. There are no stained glass windows, no incense, no soft choir echo. This is not a royal crypt either. There are no marble tombs, no heraldic lions watching her sleep. This is a pit, a stone chamber beneath the chamber, beneath the chamber. And outside, past the arched corridor, just above where roots curl down from the ceiling like bony fingers, is a field, a wide, sunless depression of land. No flowers, no names, just markers, hundreds of them, so worn they look like broken teeth in the soil. This is a slave burial ground, or, more precisely, the place where people went to be forgotten. No records, no tombstones, no names, just pits, shallow ones, sometimes shared, often not intentionally. So now you understand the question. What is she doing here? A statue that took weeks, maybe months, to carve. A woman sculpted in fine detail, from her trembling lips to her half-closed buckle. Someone who wore serpent crests and burned silk. And yet, she was placed here, with them. In the dirt, in the dark, in the mass. Why? Option 1. She belonged here all along. A prisoner, a traitor, a fallen noblewoman. The kind they mentioned once in court, then never again. Someone condemned, buried without ceremony. Her likeness preserved not out of reverence, but guilt. Option 2. She never belonged here, but someone hid her. Perhaps a servant, a daughter, a lone cleric who defied a decree. Someone carried her down here in secret, lowered her into the catacombs, and placed her among the voiceless, hoping no one would look for her in the lowest place on earth. Option 3. The one most whispered by scholars with cracked glasses and bad funding. She didn't arrive here by accident. She was put here intentionally, as a message. Because in medieval thinking, the dead speak as loud as the living through their placement. A king buried above the altar equals divine. A priest buried beneath equals humble. A queen buried among the nameless equals damned. Or worse, a warning, as if to say, this is what happens to women who know too much. This is where power without permission ends. Let her stand here among the forgotten. Let no one raise her again. And yet, here you are, looking, reading, remembering. Already, their plan is unraveling. Now shift your gaze to the surrounding stones. There are no other statues. Not one. Just flat markers, no figures, no faces. And then her, standing tall, silent, defiant, or maybe just enduring. Her feet aren't planted. They're floating slightly above the base, as if she wasn't meant to be here long, as if she expected to rise again. And here's the quietest detail. Behind her pedestal, etched so faint you'd miss it if you blinked, is a single carving, barely 2 inches wide, a closed eye, not weeping, not bleeding, just shut, as if someone once whispered to the stone, "Sleep, not yet, but soon." And now it's your turn. You're standing in a place where sorrow was designed, where silence has weight, where a woman made of stone stands among the discarded and still refuses to be unseen. Perhaps she was royal. Perhaps she was criminal. Perhaps she was just someone in between. But wherever she began, this is where she ended. Buried not under roses, not beneath marble arches, but among those who were never meant to be remembered. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the truth lasts longest. To her hands. At first, you might think they're simply crossed, perhaps in prayer, perhaps modesty, but as your eyes adjust, you realize they are not folded by choice. They are bound. Stone shackles wrapped around her wrists, like bracelets without mercy. They connect to a short chain, sculpted taut, as if someone long ago captured her final gesture and chiseled it into eternity. This is not artistic restraint. This is captivity. The wrists are angled unnaturally, not broken, but resisting, not serene, but caught. The fingers splay slightly, mid-movement, as if reaching for something, or someone, or a freedom that never came. Let's pause here. Why would anyone carve chains into a statue? In medieval sculpture, chains were symbols, not just tools. They meant power, or punishment, or protection, depending on who wore them and why. Knights sometimes wore chainmail as proof of loyalty. Prisoners wore iron as proof of guilt. But this is different, because this is stone. And chains in stone aren't just functional, they're a message, a forever sentence. So let's ask the obvious. Was she chained because she was dangerous, or because someone feared she might be? Let's consider the possibilities. Option 1. She was a prisoner, a traitor, a thief of sacred power. Perhaps she stole from the temple. Perhaps she read books she wasn't meant to read. Perhaps she spoke truths too loudly. Perhaps her womb birthed a child not sanctioned by the crown. In any medieval court, these were excellent reasons to be restrained, even better reasons to be erased. So the chains, a punishment, a final reminder of what happens to women who misstep, bound not just by law, but by legend. Option 2. She wasn't a criminal at all. She was sacred, a vessel, a warning. The chains here are not to diminish her, but to contain her, like a relic too holy to touch, like a force barely held back. A prophet, a vessel of prophecy, or as one crumbling manuscript from the outer monasteries of Thebes describes, the silent one, whose voice shatters thrones. In this version, the statue is not punishment, it's precaution. The sculptor didn't bind her out of cruelty, but fear, because even dead, she might speak again. Option 3. The chains weren't part of the original statue. No sculptor likes symmetry. No artist, even in the 14th century, enjoyed defacing their own work. But these shackles, though carved in stone, seem rougher, newer, cruder. Look closely. The wrists show signs of prior smoothness beneath the cuffs, as if something once covered them, or they were added later. This leads to a disturbing thought. Was she once unbound? Free, proud, powerful? And only after death or disgrace did someone return to shackle her? A second sculptor? Or worse, a priest with a chisel, editing her legacy. But now let's ask not what the chains are, but what they mean. Because symbolism in the Middle Ages wasn't subtle. Hands bound equals guilt. Hands free equals innocence. Hands tied in front equals shame. Hands tied behind equals execution. But her hands are tied low, to the belly, a position that suggests submission but also protection. Almost like she's shielding something herself, her secret, A child never born? Or is it theatrical? A pose staged not for mercy but for message. Here lies she who once reached too far. Let this image remain, so none may follow her, because sometimes the harshest punishment isn't death, it's reduction. Turning a woman into stone, turning movement into stillness, turning rebellion into posture. And now, one more observation. Between the cuffs, in the tiny gap between chain and wrist, is a line so thin you'd miss it, like a scar or a seam. Some believe it was once painted red, blood stylized in pigment, the final theatrical touch. A symbol that the chain wasn't just a metaphor, that it once existed, that perhaps the model for this sculpture wore it while posing, or worse, never took it off. Let's return now to the broader view. A statue buried among the forgotten, with eyes that accuse, a gown that crumples like cloth, feet that float, and hands that cannot move. What is she to you now? A martyr? A criminal? A memory? Or a reflection of every time history raised its voice to say, she must be contained? So sleep, dear listener, for she cannot raise her hands, not to wave, not to beg, not even to cover her own face. But you can, and you just did. You reached across centuries to witness her, and maybe that was the point all along. You followed the statue downward, from her face to her robe to her bound hands. Now look up, not with your own eyes, but with hers. Tilt your head gently. Retrace the invisible line from her pupils to the void above. Stone can't move, and yet she's gazing. She is not looking forward, not at you, not at the people who buried her, not at the nameless graves that rot quietly behind her back. No, her eyes are locked on the heavens. Not wide in worship, not glazed in sleep, open, focused, almost calculating. This is where the unease creeps in, because for centuries, an upward gaze in sculpture meant salvation, meant glory. Angels, saints, martyrs, they all looked to the sky, their eyes empty of this world, full of light. But this gaze is not passive. It's not surrendered. It is aware. A woman bound, erased, discarded, still looking up as if she knows what's coming. Let's look closer. Theory 1. She is praying. Eyes up equals devotion. The classic interpretation. Perhaps her death was noble. Perhaps the sculptor wanted to preserve her final act. Not rebellion, not resistance, but surrender. A plea to something greater. Forgive them. Take me. Free me. And maybe, just maybe, she believed someone would answer. Theory 2. She is accusing, but the angle's wrong. She's not looking at the sky like a saint. Her chin is too low, her brow too drawn. It's the look you give when you're tired of waiting, when prayers fail, when mercy doesn't come. It's not, please help me. It's, you watched this happen. Because what is more medieval than the belief that gods observe and remain silent? Her eyes are open, but not with hope. They burn upward, with a quiet kind of fury, not rage, not tears, just knowing, and maybe that's worse. Theory 3. She is seeing something we cannot. Now we leave history and step into fear. Some texts rare, half-burnt, written in ink made from ash and marrow speak of the skyward sleepers. Statues with eyes open to the sky, carved during eclipses, during storms, during famines. Eyes set to watch not the present, but what lies ahead. Prophetic figures, mouths closed, eyes locked, fated not to warn, only to witness. The lore says their gaze is the bridge between what was done and what shall return. Charming bedtime material. So perhaps this woman, whoever she was, saw too far not only into the court, the church, the secrets of men, but into the pattern of what comes next. And the chains, the grave, the silence weren't punishment. They were precaution, a way to mute the future before it could speak. Now, let's take one last look. Her eyes, though stone, catch the light strangely, not reflective, but not dead. Some visitors, those who believe in echoes, in shadows, in eyes that move when no one watches, claim her gaze shifts slightly as the light changes. And once a year, during the late autumn equinox, a single shaft of sunlight from the ruined ceiling slants across the chamber and lands perfectly in her pupils, as if the sky, just once, looks back. And that's when it happens, or so they say. The air stills, the silence thickens, and for a moment barely a heartbeat, barely a breath, it feels like she sees you. Not as you are, but as you will be. So what do her eyes tell you now? That she begged for help? That she cursed the gods? That she whispered warnings in her mind, carved into orbit around an unhearing heaven? We'll never know. But we do know this. She did not look down. Not at her feet, not at her chains, not at the place where they laid her. She looked up. Because some truths are too sharp to bury, too dangerous to speak, and too persistent to ever fade. Sleep now. Let your own eyes close. Let the world above you fall silent. And if, in the dark, you feel watched, don't worry. She only stares upward at what's coming, at what always comes. You've looked her in the eyes. You've seen the chains, the folds, the earth at her feet. But now you step behind her, slowly, almost guilty, because turning your back on a face like hers, even in stone, feels like a betrayal. But this is where the story turns. Her back is curved, slightly, unnaturally, like someone mid-step, interrupted, or like someone whose posture was once regal but was made to bow eternally. And then you see it, the cut. A single, deliberate gash across the center of her back. No ornament, no flourish, just a deep, horizontal line, as if carved not with a chisel but with anger. You step closer. There's more. Just beneath the line, letters, faint, jagged, unfinished, but unmistakably deliberate. At first you think it's Latin, then Greek, then something older, something not meant to be read, not easily anyway. The characters curl and twist unnaturally, like language carved by someone more used to speaking in smoke than in sound. But one part is clear, scratched not once but 3 times, reinforced maybe, or rewritten. Remember her name. Except her name isn't there. There's a space, a void between the sentence and the edge, like someone carved the sentence but refused to finish it. Or worse, finished it, and someone else erased it. You can almost see the edges of a name, now worn smooth, as if a hand returned over and over, century after century, just to rub it away. So here we are, a message left in secret, and someone fought to erase it. Let's talk about why. Theory 1. It was a secret cry. Someone who knew her, maybe loved her, returned here in secret, found her buried, forgotten, bound, and carved a desperate message. Remember her, because the world wouldn't, because no one dared speak her name. But names have power, especially in stone. So later, another Kamiya priest, a king's man, someone who understood that remembering could undo everything, and they scraped it away, not to rewrite, but to silence. Theory 2. It was a curse. In certain medieval rituals, obscure, forbidden, names were carved backward in pain to bind a spirit to its form. It was believed that if you cut a name into someone, you claimed their fate, and if you carved it into stone, they could never rise again, but only if the name remained intact. If someone came later, full of guilt, or doubt, or superstition, and broke the name, then so too broke the curse. Which means, if this was a curse, and the name is now gone, then she is no longer bound. Not fully, not safely, just waiting. Theory 3. The message was a forgery, a lie, a trap. History is not written by the victors. It's written by the survivors, and sometimes by the scavengers. Someone, centuries later, may have found this statue mysterious, haunting, wordless, and added a message of their own. Remember her. Not because they knew her, but because they wanted you to think you should. A medieval con, a trick, a myth bait. Something to lure fools, scholars, dreamers like you into searching for a story that was never there. And that name was never carved, just suggested. So you would spend the rest of your life wondering, who was she? Why was she erased? What did she know? All while the real answer is simply nothing. Just stone, just silence, maybe. Now step even closer. Above the carved line, there are puncture marks, tiny dots arranged in a circle, like teeth or fingers or a crown pressed too tightly. And just beside them, an accidental flourish, a line that trails off like a sentence interrupted, as if someone meant to write more but heard a noise, or changed their mind, or ran out of time. Whatever was meant to be told here was told halfway, like all true history, like all ghost stories, like all lives ended before the last word. And now we ask, is this carving an act of vandalism, of devotion, of fear? Are we looking at the truth, or just a layer of myth, thickened by centuries? Maybe the deeper horror isn't the message, but the fact that it was meant to be hidden, and still, someone kept coming back to try again. Carve, erase, carve, erase. Like the world couldn't decide whether to remember her or forget. Sleep now. If she was cursed, she has waited long enough. If she was innocent, she deserves your silence. And if she was neither, if she was like you, then perhaps that unfinished name is your own. You've looked into her eyes, stepped behind her, traced the cut on her back with your imagination. Now, it's time to return to the crown, or rather, what should have been a crown, because she wears none. No diadem, no wreath of gold, no celestial halo glowing in sacred stone. Instead, she wears something far more dangerous. She wears her hair, still carved, still coiled, still perfectly, defiantly intact. It falls in thick braids, not loose like a maiden's, not hidden like a nun's, but braided with purpose, like the kind worn by queens, war widows, or high priestesses at the edge of scandal. The pattern is unmistakable. 3 knots woven down the center, interlaced with what may have once been colored inlay, now faded but faintly visible under the dust. And this stylet doesn't belong to the peasants, or the convent, or the sacrificial virgins. No, this braid speaks of bloodlines, of inheritance, of women who didn't just marry power. They were born with it. In medieval symbology, hair was not just decoration. It was status, agency, threat, and that's the unsettling part. They didn't cut it. Think about that. They chained her, they buried her, they erased her name, but they left her hair, woven, royal, unburned. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was intentional. Because in medieval law and legend, a woman's hair often dictated what came after death. Loose hair equals repentance. Shorn hair equals disgrace. Veiled hair equals purity. Braided royal hair equals legacy, which begs the question, was she executed or enshrined? Let's explore both. Theory 1. She was a queen who refused to kneel. The braids were left untouched as an act of bitter irony or grudging reverence, a final, cold acknowledgement of what she was. Maybe she defied a king. Maybe she led a rebellion of her own. Maybe she bore a child not in wedlock but in defiance. And when the verdict came, they didn't dare strip her fully, because even those who destroy monarchs often fear what lingers. So they let her keep the hair as proof she died proud. She died as she was, She died as a queen, but not our queen. Theory 2. She was meant for ritual, not ruin. Some ancient rites required that a vessel, a seer, a sacrificial figure be kept physically whole. No cut hair, no missing limbs. The body must be intact for the spirit to pass cleanly. In those ceremonies, hair was a conduit, a sacred thread between flesh and the divine. Perhaps this statue isn't a memorial. It's containment. She wasn't killed. She was sealed. Her hair the final tether, woven not just for style but to bind prophecy, bloodline, or a curse. And now, hundreds of years later, still intact, still binding. Theory 3. The hair was hers to keep by will, not permission. This is the theory that scares people, because it means she chose to die this way, to be remembered this way. The braid's not ceremony, not vanity, but a final act of authorship, like a signature. If they take everything my name, my voice, my breath, they will not take this. Let them see me. Let them remember the shape of power, even if they curse it. In this telling, she is not a victim, not entirely. She is a message, and the braid is the sentence they couldn't erase. Now, kneel. Look at the lowest coil, near the nape of her neck. There's a single break, a strand undone, almost like it fell out of place before the stone set. Some believe this was a flaw. Others, a signal. One braid undone equals a story unfinished. One gap equals room for return. A whisper in limestone. Not yet. Not all of me. Not forever. Even in death. Even in dust. She left a piece loose. Now think, if her name was struck from records, her voice lost to ash, her story buried among bones, but her hair remains, what does that say about memory? About womanhood? About the things we try to cut and fail? Sleep now. Let her braids wind behind your eyes. Let them rest on your shoulder like the crown she never wore. And remember, some thrones are woven, not built. And some queens never needed gold to be dangerous. Tonight, the stone is cold. Even the shadows feel older than usual. You've seen her eyes, her chains, her braid. But beyond the chamber, beyond the carved messages and erased names, there is something else. A whisper, a trail, a myth. Because statues do not stand alone. They are born from context, or buried in it. And hers reaches back into the ruins of Thebes. No, not the Greek Thebes you learned in school. This is the forgotten Thebes, the medieval settlement that rose in its echo, half holy, half haunted, nestled in the southern ridges where the desert met the last sigh of green. A place of thresholds, of empire and exile, of silk robes and salted blood. And there, in the oldest texts, the ones written on bark and bound with animal hair, there is a name. She who faced north. They never say her real name, or if they did, it has been scratched out from every record. But her title remains cold, strange, deliberate. She who faced north. The legends differ. Of course they do. Some say she was a princess promised to a king across the sea. Others claim she was born from fire, pulled from the ashes of a comet. One scroll, burned at both edges, describes her as a servant who learned too much and loved too freely. But in all the stories, she ends in stone. That part never changes. Let's unravel the two oldest versions. They may not be true, but they are persistent. Version 1. The sacrifice of the crowned girl. In this tale, she is nobility, a daughter of the grand house of Thebes. Fifth in line, beautiful, clever, and inconvenient. She played music at dusk, learned Latin at dawn, and refused to be married off for the sake of grain treaties. Then the drought came. Crops withered. Water turned black. The moon bled. The priests gathered. declared it was the wrath of the sky, a silent deity who punished excess and rebellion. Only a willing heart from a pure bloodline could atone. They chose her, not because she was the best, but because she was just close enough to royal and just distant enough to spare the heirs. They dressed her in white, wove her hair into 9 loops, and led her into the inner chamber beneath the earth. But here's where the tale twists. She agreed. Not with weeping, not with trembling hands, but with stillness. If my death brings peace, let it come, but carve me in truth, not in flattery. Not as a lamb, but as a mirror. And so they did. The statue was made before she died, as she stood, alive, watching. She was not sedated, not blindfolded. She stared straight ahead, north, toward the cold. They say that on the 7th day, when the blood had dried and the chamber was sealed, the rains returned, the wheat stood again. But the curse never truly lifted, because every year since, one woman, always unnamed, vanished from the records, and the statue grew colder. Version 2. The Betrayal of the Fire. Blooded Witch. This tale is wilder, longer, softer at first, then sharp. She was not noble, at least not by birth. She was born in the outer settlements, raised on wind and root, but her eyes were sharp, and her dreams sharper. They say she could read before she could speak, talk to crows, healed fever with moss. By 16, she had a following. By 20, a cult. She wore no crown, but men bowed. She spoke no curse, but crops grew when she passed. The priests were polite at first, then alarmed, then angry. They summoned her, offered her a seat at the table if she agreed to stay silent. She smiled and declined. I don't want your temple. I already have a sky. So they changed their strategy. They seduced her, promised love. One priest in particular, young, with a soft voice and softer hands, he told her she would be protected. He told her she would lead the rituals, and on the night of her initiation, he turned. The wine was drugged, the chamber sealed, the knives already warm. But she did not scream, not even when they began the carving. She looked up, not at the gods, but at him. Her final words, or so the story says, were not curses but a simple prophecy. When your name is gone, mine will return. And that's why, even now, priests in that region are buried nameless, why their tombs bear no inscriptions, because none of them dare carve what could be undone. And her statue, it was made after, but her expression was remembered, carved by one of her followers who escaped, who swore she did not die defeated. She died looking ahead. Now you know what they say in Thebes. They don't call her statue the lady or the queen. They call it the reminder, because whether she was a sacrifice or a sorceress, she remains, standing, watching. And every winter solstice, when the air hangs thin and the wind sounds too much like breathing, they leave one braid of red thread at her feet, silently. No prayers, just memory. So sleep now. Let the myths tangle your dreams. Was she carved, or did she command the carving? You've walked with her down the spiral steps, into the chamber, past the dust and the dark. You've met her eyes, touched her chains, read the scar across her back. You've followed her braids, heard the legends whispered in ruined temples, and now we reach the quietest place of all, not the grave, not the myth, but the mirror. Because after all this, the history, the horror, the theories, we still don't know her name. We call her she. We give her roles: queen, vessel, witch, martyr. But beneath this stone is someone, a someone whose voice we will never recover. So the question becomes, are we discovering her, or are we simply projecting ourselves onto her? Let's take a step back. Every detail we've studied: the expression, the pose, The carvings we've read them like pages, but statues don't speak. We speak through them. We see the fear in her eyes because we know fear. We see resistance in her hands because we want her to resist. We read the braid as pride because we wish pride was allowed to last. But what if the sculptor meant none of this? What if it was just a statue, a noble woman's effigy, a tribute, a punishment, and everything else, the myth, the mourning, the mystery, came from us? Because humans hate silence, especially historical silence. So we fill it with stories, with theories, with our own longings. We want her to be powerful because we feel powerless. We want her to have been betrayed because betrayal is easier to believe than meaningless death. We want her to matter because we're afraid we won't. That's the hardest truth. This statue might not be a monument. It might be a mirror, one that only reveals what we bring to it. You look at her and see a queen. Someone else sees a witch. A third sees their mother. A fourth sees themselves. And none of you are wrong because she absorbs, she reflects, she waits. Stone doesn't care who's right. It only remembers who keeps coming back. Now ask yourself, why did this statue survive? Why wasn't it shattered? Why wasn't it stolen or forgotten or turned to rubble like the temples that once stood above it? Because people, across centuries, kept returning. Some to curse her, some to clean her, some to mourn her, some to rewrite her. She is not a monument to her life. She is a stage for whatever we fear or worship, which means she is never finished. Let's try this. Close your eyes. Picture her again, fully now, from toe to crown, bound, silent, expression locked somewhere between grief and defiance. Surrounded by rot and reverence, hair untouched, name erased. Now, replace her face with yours. Not literally, just for a moment. How would people read you? A rebel? A coward? A prophet? A liar? What would they invent from the way your eyes were shaped, from the way your hands were held, from the curve of your mouth frozen in time? Would they call you tragic, or dangerous, or both? Would they forgive you? Would they even know what needed forgiving? Or would they, like us, just guess? You see, that's the danger of memory carved in stone. It looks permanent, but it's endlessly malleable, not in form, but in meaning. And the longer it stands, the more it drifts away from who it was and toward who we need it to be. So perhaps, in the end, she is not a woman at all, not anymore. She is the embodiment of forgotten voices, a symbol for those erased too cleanly, a warning for those who rise too early, a comfort for those who fall too late. Or maybe she's just a statue, made by hands we'll never meet, for reasons we'll never fully understand. And the most honest thing we can say is, we don't know who she was, but we couldn't look away, and that's enough. So sleep now, not in fear, not in reverence, but in understanding that when you close your eyes tonight, you leave behind the stories carved into stone and walk quietly back into the ones carved into you. And if someday someone looks at your life, tries to decipher the expressions you left behind, the choices you didn't explain, maybe they'll ask, who was this? A hero? A fool? A fighter? A fraud? And maybe, just maybe, they'll realize, like you do now, that the question was never really about her. It was about us all along. You've come a long way, down the corridors of dust, through chambers of silence, across centuries smudged by time. You met her without a name, watched her through chained wrists, shattered language, and legends that contradicted each other with alarming grace. And through it all, one thing remained, the statue, unmoved, unchanged, unfinished. You were never truly learning about her. You were tracing the outlines of absence, of what happens when history loses its paperwork but leaves behind a body. You were not deciphering a person. You were standing before a shape we couldn't stop projecting onto. That's the quiet horror and the quiet beauty of memory carved in stone. It is less about truth and more about need. We needed her to be a queen, so she was. We needed her to be punished, so we imagined her crimes. We needed her to be sacred, so we lit candles to a face we never knew. But in the end, whether she was sacrifice or sorceress, criminal or crown, she became something even rarer, a fixed point in our imagination, a vessel for questions we're still afraid to ask. What is a legacy? What happens when you outlive your own name? Can silence be louder than a voice? So this is where we leave her, not with closure, not with certainty, but with something far older, respect for the unknowable. You don't need to believe the legends, or the curses, or the prophecies. You only need to believe this: she existed, and someone once wanted her remembered. And tonight, you did just that. In your mind, in your breath, in that still moment between waking and sleep. So rest now. Let the stone stand. Let her eyes stay open. Let the questions echo a little longer in the dark. Not all stories are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be witnessed.